The Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in Kursk and in Donetsk. But is this part of a larger campaign or just taking advantage of the opportunities the Russians present? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about this and Ukraine's strategy on the ground. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is actually a pretty interesting story. You can see here, we haven't checked at the Kursk region for some time, and you can see as we back up about 2 days ago, this region here, again, sort of around this very small village of Kamyasivka, we see Ukrainian forces advancing, closing off, again, a pocket here of terrain that, again, is not containing anything of particular value, but it is sort of advancing them in a stepping stone along this roadway here, which is, can be considered a pretty key avenue of approach on the way to Kurchatov. Now, it's unlikely, to be honest, that you're going to see the Ukrainians advance all the way to Kurchatov, right, given the sort of slowing momentum. And you can also see that on the opposite side, you've got Russian forces who have reportedly seized Snagos. You can see here is the 11th of September, and you can see that subsequently Russian forces, right, staging their significant counterattack here, and then subsequent advances by Russian troops kind of contesting a larger and larger region. This is even as Ukrainian troops try to advance a few kilometers away, but they seem to be somewhat stalled near Vesoloye. Again, the idea of the Ukrainians was to sort of trap these Russian forces here south of the Sime, and instead they seem to have cleared themselves a little bit of breathing room. And so it's unclear how effective this sort of pincer attempt will be by the Ukrainians. When we look over here, actually, there's one other location I wanted to point out, and that is near, I think it is, actually, I don't need to think. I can just check the data. And this is, let's see, Zaliz Nianeski. And this is, of course, here in the Donetsk region, and you can see Ukrainian forces, right, pushing back against the Russians as they kind of advanced into this rectangular series of windbreaks. You can see the Ukrainians here staging a counterattack, retaking this territory. The real question that you're kind of left with, though, is more a question of why. You can see that the Russians have held this territory for some time, so it's not entirely clear why the Ukrainians looked at this and said, this is where we want to stage the attack. My only thesis would be perhaps that the Ukrainians want to use this area here. They want to get themselves on the northern bank of this small river or canal system, and that having this as a barrier is going to allow them to improve their efficiency of their defense. We've seen this before where these kind of obstacles can make defenses more efficient, right? Because Russians are going to have a very hard time assaulting this, right? You can't drive a vehicle into a river or a lake. And so for Russians, they're going to have a limited number of avenues of approach. That means it can be guarded by fewer troops. Given the fact that their only way to cross would be a series of choke points, it's going to perhaps allow the Ukrainians to smooth their defenses. And you can see here, the rest of this front is actually pretty stable because the Ukrainians are defending along with this ridge line here and this low ground, right? They forced the Russians to be on the far side of these lakes and on the low side of this ridgeline. You could see even the swampland here, which is also very difficult to cross. So I think the Ukrainians are trying to simply stabilize this defensive line. Again, possibly to free up troops and just improve the efficiency of their defensive effort. Very interesting, though, and it's, again, perhaps a good sign that even in these localized kind of ways, the Ukrainians are still looking and saying, listen, we still have the resources to go on offense. We can seize limited terrain from Russian forces even as they continue their advances. And you can kind of see it, right? There's a number of small areas where we've seen Ukrainian forces again, kick back against the Russians. Not at scale, not as part of any kind of sustained campaign. The only place that we've really seen that happen is, of course, in Kursk. But this is part of, I think, a sign that the Ukrainians are more effective at fighting their fight, so to speak. And you can see here, according to a live UA map, that this shows Ukrainian positions as somewhat more stable, still having lost Snagost, but without this big sort of this big drive by Russian forces into this sort of pocket here formed by the Sime. So you can see that there's a general consensus. They're also reporting this area south of Vesoloye as being seized by Ukrainians, whereas other sources listed as contested. But you can see the general consensus, again, remains that there's a pretty stable area seized here in Kursk, and that there is increasingly localized instances where Ukrainian forces are actually pushing back against the Russians. Anyway, guys, before we talk about some of the more tactical updates, I want to mention that if you want to support this channel, if you want to get access to uncensored combat footage, you want to become a member of combatvetnews.com. It just works just like Patreon. Twice a week, I drop uncensored combat footage analysis. We look at the GoPros, the drone footage, the kind of stuff YouTube won't let me show you. And we do an uncensored breakdown for all the tiers. If you want to support a little more, right, you can become a lieutenant tier, get access to that weekly Q&A. You can ask me anything from my time in Afghanistan to my favorite food to what I think about Ukraine's latest drones. And of course, if you want the by name shoutouts to be one of the 2 true top tier supporters, you'll get that by name shout out at the end of videos. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sort of the larger strategic picture here. And what I think is interesting is that we've seen a lot of evidence that the Ukrainians have been targeting Russian logistics, targeting ammunition facilities and mobile radar facilities. That may be preparation for something larger that we're seeing here, or it may simply be a sense that the Ukrainians think that Russia's logistics and their munitions is actually one of their largest vulnerabilities. We've got, again, you see that they're taking out, 30,000 tons of munitions in these factories, the equivalent of 750,000 artillery shells, and Russian forces, of course, averaging 10,000 a week. So you're talking about, what's that? About, so almost a year's worth of artillery shells worth of munitions. Ukraine strike to 2 to 3 months of Russia's ammunition supply. So this is, I think, is this a sign that Ukraine is preparing for something larger? I think it may be, because we've also heard a little bit in the news about Zelensky's victory plan that he's planning on bringing to Western powers. And while we're unlikely to see the detailed victory plan, again, this is something that likely they're going to want to keep under wraps. I think it may be a sign that Ukraine wants to demonstrate to its partners that it's capable of achieving even more than it has already. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to our Colonel tier members like Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gaius Marning, Eugene Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, Franciscarius, L90, and Petra Tororu, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you over there tomorrow. Cheers.